Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope that you're doing exceedingly well and that you've had the most wonderful day or are about to embark on a wonderful day, depending of course on your time zone. So I just want to send love to each and every one of you, so let's get started. But if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the day we arrived at our Airbnb mountain retreat, I immediately sensed something was insidiously wrong, and it was a gut feeling that I just could not shake off. We were in a remote area surrounded by exquisite mountainous views of smoking blue statuesque mountains that rose up in the sky like imposing masterful pyramids, and the ever so delightful Swiss-style picturesque log cabin was flanked on one side by an exquisite forest of towering, majestic tall trees, and there was a silvery lake surrounded by a scattering of pretty evergreen Christmas trees, and its sparkling surface reflected the mountains and the trees like a shimmering mirror. This was the kind of view you would expect to find on the cover of a box of Swiss chocolates. So why, if I was surrounded by such idyllic, extraordinary beauty, did I feel this rising sense of foreboding and nausea that welled up in the back of my throat, with a very bitter aftertaste? I knew something was off, but I planted a positive smile on my face as I watched my husband remove our suitcases from the taxi cab and give the driver a very generous tip. And then we watched him driving away down the precarious, rather bumpy dirt road. "So what do you think?" said my husband, pulling out the large brass key from his pocket. "Would you like to do the honours?" he said, handing me the key. I turned the key in the lock and opened the door. The cabin was so resplendently decorated with exquisite oakwood furnishings and comfortable, superbly upholstered couches, not to mention a state-of-the-art modern kitchen where no expense has been spared. And then, of course, there was an incredible bedroom, and when I say incredible, I mean incredible. The bedroom was utterly enchanting, with its own wraparound porch and sliding glass doors that extended out onto an outside patio. You would step out onto a really gorgeous wooden deck, with steps that led down into the yard. This deck was adorned with high-quality outside furnishings that overlooked the sensational panoramic mountainous views. Then there was sumptuously attired king-size bed, which was smartly dressed with the finest layers of crisp Egyptian white cotton bedding that was extravagantly sprinkled with pretty pink and red rose petals, and there was, of course, a bottle of champagne on ice in a bucket, not to mention a white towel that was shaped into a swan. It was like we were really being welcomed. "It's so beautiful," I said to my husband as he opened the champagne and poured me a glass of bubbling champagne, and we clinked our glasses together. "Happy 5th anniversary," said my husband, kissing me affectionately. "Thank you for making me a very happy man and putting up with all my nonsense." "What nonsense?" I teased. "I don't know," he said. "I suppose I can be preoccupied with my work sometimes and not give you the attention you deserve." Suddenly we heard a woman's voice calling out, "Hello there!" "That must be our landlady," said Finn, as we went in the hallway to greet her. I noticed that our landlady was a buxom woman in her early 60s, with long white hair tied back together in a rather messy pigtail. She also possessed a rather exposed, sun-damaged skin and very pretty blue eyes. "Welcome to America," said the lady, "but everything is flat, so everyone just cycles absolutely everywhere." "I know all about Holland," said the woman, tapping the end of her nose. And then she whispered something to my husband in his ears and giggled, and then retreated out of the cabin door and got back into her car and finally drove off. "What on earth did she say to you?" I asked my husband curiously, that she clearly didn't want me to hear. "She said, 'I know all about the red light district, but your secret is safe with me.'" I gasped in horror. "Is that what people think of Holland, that we're one big blazing red light district? That's horrifying." "Well, let's not kid," laughed my husband. "Cynthia is a little eccentric. One thing that perturbed me, though, is why would she say that we must not be worried about banging at night, because this is an old cabin, when clearly it's not? I would say that this cabin is very, very new. It's only been recently built. It's incredibly new." "Well, that's a bit extraordinary," I said. "It's a rather peculiar thing to say." Before long, Finn and I were settling down in the cabin, and we soon decided to retire to bed early that evening, as we were both feeling rather tired, and I decided to read the visitor's book to Finn. "Listen to this," I read to my husband. "This is from a lady called Eva Johansson from Sweden. I really loved my stay at the cabin, but I kept seeing a strange face staring at me through the window at night. I think it was a bear, and they can be very inquisitive. So do keep your curtains drawn, unless you want to get the fright of your life, which I did. Word of warning, the house can be incredibly noisy because of the old pipes. So my advice to all visitors, do not be alarmed by the noise. Otherwise, I really enjoyed my stay." "Wow," said my husband. "They keep going on about the old pipes banging, but that's absolute nonsense. This place is new. There are no old pipes." "Well, this is a comment from Carlotta Wagner from Austria," I continued. "Very beautiful log cabin. Thanks for great hospitality, Cynthia. Just wanted to say that noises at night did bother me rather a lot. Something big was walking around our cabin. I assumed it was the bear that you were telling me about, but it was making these horrible grunting sounds that were very unsettling. And I do believe this bear was possibly making the banging sounds as well. I don't necessarily believe it's old pipes, because I did check your pipes and they look rather new. You should warn your guests, because it was really quite scary, and even my husband was freaking out. And he does not scare that easily. Just a word of advice, that's all, but had a fabulous time. Thanks so very much." "Well, I'm not bothered about a bear loitering around the cabin at night," said my husband. "Are you?" "No," I said. "I rather like the idea of being visited by bears, although I do hope the critter will let us get some sleep. Listen to this, it's from Sasha Fisher, all the way from Germany. This is a quaint, charming, idyllic cabin, but there is something not right about this place. Sorry, Cynthia, but I had to say it. There is something menacing around your cabin that really made me feel distinctly unsettled. Maybe you should investigate the position of the cabin. Could it be built on an old Indian burial ground? I say that because there is something outer-worldly about this place, and during my stay I could never ever relax. I felt as if something was watching me. And in the woods, when my husband and I went walking, I believe we were being stalked. I always got the sense that something or someone didn't want us here. Also, as you pointed out, Cynthia, the old pipes in this place really give me the creeps and the heebie-jeebies. They made quite a lot of noise during the night, so it was very hard to get any sleep. Otherwise, a really enchanting cabin, and I did enjoy my stay. Many, many thanks." "Wow," I said. "Can you believe that? Is this Sasha lady suggesting that the place is haunted?" "Maybe," I said, "or why would she be talking about an Indian burial ground? Do you think she saw something supernatural?" "Very possible," said my husband, "although I've never been convinced by the supernatural myself. I've got to admit that as picture-perfect as this cabin is, there is definitely something airy about this place." I looked at my husband in shock. "I felt it too the moment we came here. It was as if something wasn't quite right," I said. "Well, we're here now," said my husband, "and the views are breathtaking. Let's just make the best of our time here. I'm sure it'll be fine." Our first night in our cabin was so peaceful that Finn and I slept in really, really late, and were absolutely amazed to discover that we awoke at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and so we decided to take it easy that day, and we thought we'd take a light afternoon walk in the woods, so that's exactly what we did. I must say the woods were quite enchanting, with towering mature trees consisting of sugar maples, American beech, eastern hemlock, yellow birch and northern red oak trees, and as we entered the forest we encountered some of the fattest-looking turkeys that I've ever seen, that had clearly never graced a Thanksgiving dinner plate before, and were not as jittery about our presence as you would have expected. Surprisingly, they didn't even scuttle away, but continued to peck at the ground very happily. I was pretty certain that no one ever hunted in these woods. We noticed some healthy-looking grouse, and the forest was literally full of the most captivating songbirds that sang the most delightful bird songs. We also encountered some rather timid white-tailed deer, but once again they did not scamper away when they saw us, but watched us very warily from a distance with a keen curiosity. As we ventured further in the woods, to our utter amazement, we encountered a very delightful pebbly stream that meandered through the woods with a furiously strong current. I immediately threw off my socks and shoes and paddled in the crisp clear water, and was eagerly joined by my husband Finn. Even though we're both adults, it's amazing how pebbly stream like this can rejuvenate and inspire childlike nostalgic memories, and the child in me came rising to the surface with an exuberant enthusiasm, my husband as well. We both sat on a rocky outcrop that jutted above the flowing stream, throwing pebbles and talking about all our experiences of 5 long years of marriage. Suddenly I was absolutely sure I had seen a silhouette of a very powerful-looking Indian warrior with a strong, broad, stoic-looking face, wearing a long flowing headdress of eagle's feathers, and it looked like it was embellished with beadwork and natural leather. I was certain I had seen him standing there staring at us, but then he vanished so fast I was almost certain that I had imagined it all. "Did you see that?" I asked my husband. "See what?" Finn asked. "Nothing," I said, thinking to myself that I was going stark raving mad. We decided to leave the forest, but suddenly we began to hear the very enchanting ethereal music again, that sounded ominously like a mixture of drums, rattles and flutes, and we could hear some rather strange, curious chanting. My husband looked at me, startled. "That sounds like Cherokee Indian music," he said to me in horror. I thought that there was no one around here, but clearly I was wrong. "I thought I actually saw an Indian warrior earlier," I told him. I was almost certain he was staring at me. "Let's see if we can find the source of the music," said Finn. "There has to be a rational explanation for this." As my husband and I entered the heart of the forest, the music got louder and louder and louder, and then we stood at the edge of the clearing, and we clearly saw several American Indians wearing those beaded cotton tunics and Indian headdresses, and they appeared to be dancing around a crackling fire in a counterclockwise circle, with a woman following the men, and all appeared to be attired in traditional Cherokee attire. My husband and I watched this strange dance from behind the cover of a large maple tree and listened to the amazing ethereal music, and I was bopping my head up and down in time to the music and beaming brightly. "This is so lovely," I reflected. "I wonder where all these people came from." Suddenly the music dissipated as fast as smoke leaving a chimney in a furious windstorm. For a moment the figures seemed to go out of focus, rather like a hazy, blurred-looking photograph, and then they simply vanished before our eyes. My husband and I literally stared at the clearing with eyes growing as wide as saucers, hardly daring to believe what we had just observed. "Did you see that?" I said in horror. "They vanished before our very eyes, but they were here. You did see them, didn't you?" Finn, who normally never believed in the paranormal, was looking at me with a befuddled, disorientated expression on his face. He looked as if I had just thrown a glass of icy cold water at him. "That didn't just happen," he said. "Tell me I was just seeing things." My husband walked over to the area where we had observed the crackling fire, and all we could see was some smoky ash rising in the air like a fine white smoke. When we touched it, we discovered that it was as cold as ice. "Feel that?" said Finn. "It feels like an ice cube, and yet it's smoking like the embers of a dying fire." "This is nothing short of super weird," he said. "It's like we're in the Twilight Zone, or on an ambiguous reality with no rational explanation. I might understand an experience like this if we were hallucinating from magic mushrooms, but what we've just witnessed rarely transpired, and it's onerous to come to accept as reality because none of it makes any sense at all. This sort of stuff is meant for the movies, not for everyday life. What on earth just happened?" Our strange experience was so peculiarly odd, but my husband and I were so excited to have finally experienced something that was outer-worldly. But when you have an escapade like this, whatever your religious aspirations or orientation, you're certainly forced to conclude that energy does exist after death. Even Finn, who was a hardened cynic and a staunch atheist at the time, was forced to shift his perception of reality after he observed these Indians dancing in the woods, which was a struggle for him to even comprehend. That night when we returned to our cosy bed, we reflected on what we had seen, and before long we eventually fell fast asleep. I was awoken to the sound of banging pipes, and the rattling noise was so disturbing I was glad that Cynthia had warned us all about it, so that I wasn't so scared. The banging, pounding and hammering sound persisted for a long time, and yet Finn just remained fast asleep. He was dead to the world. He was always a deep sleeper, but sleeping through this disturbing noise seemed ridiculous to me. He must be really... I was not sure whether this critter was real or not. I know that sounds strange, but after having witnessed the apparitions of the Indians earlier, I was beginning to find it very difficult to distinguish between reality and fiction, what was real and what was not. I watched the creature gliding into the forest, and it looked like it was floating when it moved, which made me feel absolutely certain that I was observing a ghost of some kind. I do not know what overcame me, but I suddenly got this irrational urge to follow the critter. Cynthia had warned us about not venturing out at night, but maybe she knew about the paranormal occurrences in the wood and was terrified of scaring her guests half to death, because she didn't want such rumours to affect her bed and breakfast business, which was perfectly understandable in the circumstances. It was not something you would wish to advertise unless you were opening a haunted attraction, which was not the case in our circumstances. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the critter, but it had already disappeared into the wood, but I was no less determined to follow it. As I entered the wood, it was very, very airy, and it did not possess the same cheerful ambience that I had noticed earlier during the day. On the contrary, I could feel the silence of this dusky night, and it was so quiet that I could literally hear my own breath before my face. There were no sounds of the night at all that you would expect to hear, like the usual coyotes, owls, frogs, and crickets, which was exceedingly unsettling for me. Suddenly breaking the ghostly silence was the sound of ominous galloping hooves that were thundering towards me with a jet energy and power of the Derby horse race. It was utterly terrifying to sense this formidable energy thrashing towards me with such a force. Before I had a chance to retreat from the woods, I was suddenly standing yards away from the Indian warrior that I had observed earlier in the day. But this time I saw him. He was seated on the back of a huge, magnificent-looking black stallion. If you'd not known any better, you would definitely have believed that he was physically real. But the way the warrior and his horse were lit up was, I can assure you, not normal by any strength of the imagination. It was not of this world. It was like they were both bathed in a glowing, sparkling, white, supernatural light, one that I've never been able to explain. I was so transfixed that my mouth hung open and my eyes grew as wide as saucers. In that moment I was so beguiled and bedazzled and amazed by what I was observing that my fear was suppressed by this heightened feeling of awe and wonder. Was I really seeing this, or was I hallucinating, I wondered. Finally the Indian warrior spoke, and his voice sounded like rushing water. It was powerful, imposing, and commanding in its narration. "Sister," he said to me, "you need to leave this place now. This is the burial ground of the Tsal Kalu and all his descendants. He will be sending the winds of fire to burn down your cabin now. He has sounded the warnings to your kin on numerous occasions, but no one has heeded them. His patience has been lost, and his frustration risen to greatness. We cannot protect you if you do not heed my warning." Suddenly he turned around and galloped through the forest and was gone. I turned around and walked back towards the cabin, and that was when I saw the monstrous humanoid ape-like critter that I had followed into the forest in the first place. His back was now facing me, and he was only 100 yards ahead of me, moving stealthily towards the cabin, with a large piece of fiery timber in his huge hands. It was clear what this creature's motivation was. He was planning to burn down our cabin. I immediately ran as fast as I could to the far side of the cabin, and my anxiety levels literally hit the roof. I was shaking from terror and running like an inebriated drunk, as my fear had seemingly caused the wiring in my brain to disconnect with its physical pathways. I became clumsy and disorientated in my desperation to get to Finn in time, and this was hijacked by my ability to remain calm and composed. I was so alarmed because all I could think about was Finn and how I needed to wake him up now, because it was very clear that this creature wanted to burn down our cabin. The creature was heading towards the front side of the cabin and was lighting up the timber beams, which was absolutely amazing because wooden cabins tend to have much more fire resistance to normal homes. But our cabin was lighting up like a Christmas tree, and very fast. I ran around the back end of the cabin, up the steps of the wraparound porch, and rammed as hard as I could on the grass window pane, and I was shouting Finn's name. "Finn!" I screamed. "Finn! Finn! Wake up! Wake up now!" Suddenly I saw Finn staring at me through the glass pane of the sliding door, which pulled back slowly. He was yawning and wiping the sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing out there?" he asked in amazement. "And why do you look like a deer caught in headlights?" "We need to leave now," I screamed, grabbing the bag with our passport, phone and money. "The cabin is on fire." For a moment Finn looked a little muddled and confused, and so I pushed him towards the porch, very forcefully, and when he finally saw the fire that was engulfing the front side of the cabin, he literally sprinted with me towards the outer edges of the wood. We stood there in awe, watching the cabin engulfed in flames, burning down incredibly fast, and we immediately called Cynthia. "What is the heck going on?" asked Finn. "How on earth did the cabin catch on fire, and what were you doing outside?" "Finn," I said, "if I understood what was going on, I would tell you, but I cannot explain anything that has happened since we've been here. It's all very anomalous to me." Cynthia soon arrived. There she was, in her dressing gown and slippers, and struggling out of her car, and then she came bolting towards us. "Do you know what's happened?" she asked. I shook my head. I mean, how could I tell her about the strange humanoid ape that had lit up the cabin in flames? Cynthia was shaking her head aggressively. "I don't understand it," she said. "This is the 4th time this cabin has burnt to the ground. It keeps happening over and over again. Even the fire investigator doesn't know how these timber beams burn down so fast. It's all very odd. If I didn't know any better, I would think it was done on purpose, but the previous fires appear to have no sign of accelerant used, so something very bizarre is going on." I looked at Cynthia very kindly and took her lovingly in my arms to comfort her. I could tell she was terribly upset, and who could blame her? "Something tells me, Cynthia," I said, "that maybe you shouldn't build a cabin here. Every one of them seems to be burnt down. It seems to me that the earth is trying to tell you something. Perhaps it's not happy with it being here. Maybe it's sacred land." "Well, this was formerly a Cherokee Indian settlement," said Cynthia. "I'd never thought of the ground being sacred before, but it might explain some of the anomalies my guests have experienced in the cabins." Fast forward a few weeks. The good news was that Cynthia was able to transfer us to another cabin in a different area, so Finn and I got to enjoy the rest of our anniversary, but we did have to buy a brand new wardrobe of clothes, and we had a wonderful time in America. When I arrived back to Holland and researched some family history, I was amazed to discover that my great-great-grandfather was American Cherokee Indian. Looking back on everything that transpired, I think the apparition of the Cherokee Indian warrior knew I was of Cherokee lineage, which was why he was watching over me like a guardian of some kind, and was why he referred to me as sister. I was also to discover that the critter I observed was in fact a Bigfoot that the Cherokee call Tekali, which is another word for Cherokee devil. When I returned to Holland, I researched everything online, and living in this part of the world, I had naturally never heard of Bigfoot before, but I now know that that is what I saw that night. Naturally, at first I thought the critter was a ghost because he moved with such a seamless, flawless grace that he looked like he was literally floating. I think the reason the critter kept burning down all the log cabins that Cynthia invariably built was because she was building the cabins on the burial ground of the Cherokee devil's descendants, and I believe he didn't want a cabin built over the graves of his forefathers. I do realise, of course, how lucky Finn and I to be alive, because we could have been burnt to death in that cabin. What I'd like to say to your listeners is that I know my story may sound very far-fetched, spurious and fictitious, and I wouldn't blame you for doubting it at all, but I promise you it's true, and even though it happened in the year 2000, I want to assure you that 20 years on, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I can only say that you experience something outside the realms of your reality. It's very hard to move away from your fixed, perceived paradigm of the world. Even all these years later, I have to ask myself, did I really see that, or was it my imagination? It's such a struggle to accept, and no one finds it a greater challenge to accept than Finn, of course, as you can imagine. So there you are. That's my story. Well, what a fabulous story, and I certainly believe it. I think it's an incredible story, and I'm amazed by it. So thank you for sharing. Until next time, goodbye and good night.